You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
New Year, same extra value meals at McDonald's. So now get 2 snack wraps, plus fries, and a medium soft drink for just $8.
For limited time only. Prices and participation may vary. Prices may be higher in Hawaii, Alaska, and California, and for delivery.
Starting a business can seem like a daunting task, unless you have a partner like Shopify. They have the tools you need to start and grow your business. From designing a website to marketing to selling and beyond, Shopify can help with everything you need. There's a reason millions of companies like Mattel, Heinz, and Allbirds continue to trust and use them. With Shopify on your side, turn your big business idea into... Sign up for your $1 per month trial at shopify.com/special offer.
Hello everyone and welcome to History of the Second World War, episode 246, Yugoslavia Part 2, The Invasion. This week, a big thank you goes out to Tobias, Yuji, Zach, Andrew, and Joshua for supporting the podcast by becoming members. Members get access to ad-free versions of all of the podcast episodes, plus special member-only episodes roughly once a month. Head on over to historyofthesecondworldwar.com/members to find out more. While the lead-up to the invasion of Yugoslavia had been a long, slow process, involving months and months of diplomatic conversations and negotiations, the invasion would be almost exactly the opposite. The forces of the Yugoslav army were outmatched and surrounded, with German forces invading the nation from multiple different directions starting on the morning of April 6th. Just 11 days later, the country would officially surrender to the Germans, with the occupation of Yugoslavia then being split between German and Italian forces. The resulting situation would be confusing, with one of the consequences being that Yugoslavia would be one of the most active areas of resistance against the occupation forces. But this legacy of resistance was far from the mind of the Yugoslav leaders when they staged their coup on March 27th, because they didn't necessarily understand just how imminent the German invasion was, even as they were trying to prepare for it. One of the reasons that the invasion was such a pressing matter for the Germans was because the German military was on a timetable. Before the Germans had committed to helping the Italians in the invasion of Greece, they had already decided that 1941 would be the year that the German army would invade the Soviet Union. Even working back from some of the more optimistic forecasts of how quickly that invasion would occur and how easily the Soviet state would collapse under the supposed might of the Wehrmacht, the invasion had to start as early in the year as possible. However, the so-called Operation Barbarossa could not start in the spring due to rains in much of the Soviet Union that made movement very difficult. So the commitment of what would turn into 6 panzer divisions for operations in Greece and then adding Yugoslavia to that list was not disastrous to the timetables of the later operations. The bigger problem for the German high command is that they had very little time to plan the invasion of Yugoslavia because it was only added as a target on March 27th. The plan had been to simply move to Greece, and now before that could happen, another invasion would have to happen. And the planning staffs had no option but to simply go to work. The good news is that the Germans had a major advantage in many aspects of the forces involved, including their armor divisions, which included about 850 tanks. Now, about half of those tanks were older Panzer 1s, 2s, and 35T models, but that also meant that there were 400 or so modern top-of-the-line medium tanks, your Panzers 3s, 4s, and 38Ts. They were also already well-positioned to move on Yugoslavia due to the pre-existing plans for the attack on Greece. This was because they had already been planning on moving into Greece from Bulgaria, and the best option for invading Yugoslavia was to attack from Bulgaria. The end result of all of this planning is that one German force would invade from the north, from Austria and Hungary. This would be the Second Army, and it would set the date for the invasion of April 6th because it was the earliest sort of possible moment that it could be ready to join the operation. But the primary point of attack were the 2 forces that would move from the east and then from the southeast into Yugoslavia, and these were both coming from Bulgaria. The southernmost units of the 12th Army would also be able to cut across southern Yugoslavia to cut off any possibility of assistance arriving from Greece or the British from the south. This southernmost force would also have the additional benefit of supporting the Italian forces that were having so many difficulties in Albania due to the Greek advance from the south. This advance is something that we will be covering in the future. In total, the German forces represented around 330,000 men, with roughly the same number of Italian forces positioned near the southwestern border, although no major joint operations were planned. If everything went well, and according to the plan, the Germans could expect a quick and decisive campaign, exactly the kind that they always wanted to fight at this point in the war. This would allow them to then move into Greece quickly, and would also free up the Danube River to reopen to merchant shipping. The Danube was an invaluable transportation link in southeastern Europe, one that the German economy took full advantage of during this part of the war, transporting goods throughout the region. And so any military action happening around the Danube ran the risk of that vital supply artery being cut off from sort of use by the Germans, and so reopening the Danube was always an important priority. For the defending army, the situation was looking a bit rough at the end of March. The numbers were there, with about 600,000 men mobilized in the weeks before the invasion, but that number was very deceptive. The first problem is that most of that number were seriously lacking in up-to-date military training, and they would basically be sent to the front without any kind of refresher period. The second problem was equipment. There simply was not enough of anything. Many types of modern equipment, artillery, anti-tank guns, for example, were seriously lacking. There were only a few hundred modern aircraft, roughly split evenly between fighters and bombers, and there was also almost no modern armored units. Just as importantly, the entire army suffered from a serious shortage of motorized transport, which made it difficult to move forces around before the invasion. It would also make it almost impossible to move forces around to respond to a German armored thrust, which had been one of the primary reasons that the German army had been so successful in France and Poland. But the problems for the Yugoslav army also involved simple geography. But the problems did not end there for the Yugoslav army, and they also involved simple geography. There were areas of Yugoslavia that were mountainous and rugged, perfect for a long defense by an infantry-heavy army, which is what the Yugoslavs had. But those areas were primarily in the south and west. The capital of Belgrade and the critical industrial areas of northern Yugoslavia were at much greater risk of a German attack. If Yugoslavia wanted to win a war, these areas could not be abandoned for both logistical and morale reasons, but defending them would tie down major elements of the Yugoslav army in positions that were difficult to defend. It also robbed them of any kind of strategic mobility that would make them vulnerable to getting surrounded by Germans and cut off from the rest of the country, which is exactly what the Germans planned to do. The Yugoslav High Command also made the mistake of trying to defend all of its borders, to try and retain as much territory as possible, devoting about 80% of the total available forces to defending those borders. This spread the overmatched forces quite thin, and in many areas there was not any kind of fixed defenses or natural obstacles. It also meant that there were not nearly enough reserves should a German breakthrough occur at any point along the line. But at the same time, it would have been difficult to find enough transport to meet such a breakthrough anyway, so I guess it can be easy to criticize some of these decisions. I don't necessarily have a better idea for them. And that's just something to keep in mind when thinking about this kind of defense plan. The Yugoslavs gave it the code-named Plan R41, because even though we can criticize it today, it's going to fail horribly. I'm not sure there were any good answers. And even a far more defensive approach that gave up most of the border regions in favor of some kind of, national redoubt strategy would have only delayed their defeat. It would not have prevented it. Honestly, it's difficult to see how any decisions could have been changed to prevent a German victory. The one thing they could have changed, though, was to act on the invasion when they found out that it was going to occur. This is because the Yugoslav High Command learned of the pending German invasion with 4 days of warning, but they chose to ignore that warning. This meant that when the assault began on the morning of April 6th, they were completely unprepared. As was so often the case, the first attack would be launched by the Luftwaffe, with German bombers focusing on bombing the capital of Belgrade in the early morning hours. The available fighters of the Yugoslav Air Force would rise to meet them, but they were very quickly outnumbered and outclassed by their German opponents, and the later raids of the day would be able to fly around the skies almost completely unmolested. In total, 66 Yugoslav aircraft would be destroyed in the early hours of the invasion, most of them while they were still on the ground on their airfields. As if to emphasize the unpreparedness of the Yugoslav government and military, thousands of civilians would die in Belgrade due to the German bombings, with some estimates placing the number as high as 17,000. All along the borders between Yugoslavia, Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria, German forces began their advance, although some of the advances would be delayed a few days simply because they could not be ready in time. In the south, they would quickly push through the border regions, and within just hours, they were already capturing critical objectives. After these objectives were captured, they would turn south and begin pushing towards Greece. The Italians did also eventually declare war on Yugoslavia, although it would not occur until April 9th, and they would not cross the border until the 11th. By that time, most of the resistance from the Yugoslav army was already falling apart. Belgrade was also surrounded on the 11th, and it would be taken by German forces on the 13th without any major fighting happening within the city itself. The primary reason for this was the fact that it was not really that important anymore. The failure of the defenses to the north and the south of the capital meant that it would be mostly abandoned by the Yugoslav army, which would retreat further to the south. The surrender of the capital would be the trigger for a decision to be made by the Yugoslav leaders to try and work out a ceasefire and an armistice with the Germans. There had been many Yugoslav units that had surrendered during the first week of the invasion, but on the 14th it suddenly turned into an avalanche. An official conversation started between Germany and Yugoslav representatives to end the war. Honestly, by that point, Yugoslavia, as a single political entity, was already beginning to disappear, with Croatia having declared its independence as soon as Zagreb was captured by the Germans. On the 17th, the official surrender would occur, and the last Yugoslav troops, which had managed to make it to the Adriatic, would surrender. In total, there would be about 600 German casualties during the operation, although there would also be several thousand Italians and several hundred Hungarians that would be added to the casualty counts. On the Yugoslav side, the numbers are much more difficult to determine. Due to the lengthy German and Italian occupation after the invasion, and the complete disorganization of the defenses during the early days of the attack, accurate record keeping was impossible. The one number that is known is that somewhere between 284,000 and 375,000 men were captured from the Yugoslav army.
This podcast is brought to you by Carvana. Selling your car shouldn't feel like a second job. It should feel easy. With Carvana, it is. Just visit Carvana.com, enter your license plate or VIN, answer a few quick questions, and get an offer in minutes. Like what you see? We'll pick it up right from your door and hand you your check. No haggling, no hassle, no problem. Car selling made easy on Carvana. Pickup fees may apply.
After the invasion was over, in their attempts to analyze their actions, the German General Staff were actually surprised that the Yugoslav army had fallen apart so quickly. They knew that there were weaknesses, and they knew the German forces would win eventually, but the fact that it happened in just 11 days was shocking. And if you read history books on the campaign, what becomes clear is that while there were specific instances of Yugoslav forces putting up stout resistance, it was very much the exception. And in fact, the bigger challenge that the Germans had was down to geography and roads. The Germans also had to deal with other armies at this time. This would be the first campaign in which the German forces had worked closely together with allied armies in Eastern Europe. This arrangement would become much more common later in the war on the Eastern Front, but at this point in the war, the Germans were very new to coalition warfare. What became clear very rapidly is that if the Germans wanted these coalition armies to be able to work with them and achieve the goals that the Germans expected they would, well, those armies were going to need German help. The armies of Germany's allies were different than their own, often less well equipped, and their training was also just different. And so if they were to be held to German standards, they would need German units and officers to ensure that they worked well, and they would need a lot of German equipment. Another unexpected reality was just how divided Yugoslavia was as a country, and how many different groups there were within the populace that were more than willing to work with the Germans against the Central Serbian-dominated authorities. The largest group of people were the Croats in Croatia, but they were just one of many groups that in the aftermath of the founding of Yugoslavia after the First World War, they were quickly disillusioned with the entire idea. Because what they realized is that while they were happy to no longer be part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, they were dominated by the Serbs at a political level. And they'd kind of, at least in their minds, traded a government centered in Vienna for one centered in Belgrade. After the relative honeymoon period of the early years of Yugoslavia, the animosity between the Serbs and Croats specifically would grow quite fierce. This animosity would spill into the fighting during the German invasion, and in some places Croatian units would simply throw down their arms and start going home as soon as the Germans arrived. There were even instances where Croatian officers and men actively attacked Serbian units that were resisting the German invasion. This fighting was not typical, it was not widespread, but it did happen. Meanwhile, back in Croatia, the news of the German invasion was met not with trepidation and concern, but instead with joy, with the hope that it would mean the end of Serbian leadership within Croatian territory. While the speed of the invasion surprised many people, one of those people was also Mussolini. The Italian leader had long dreamed of taking a very active role in shaping what a new Yugoslavia would look like. The expansion of Italian control into these areas had been a primary fixture of Mussolini's political platform from the very beginning, and was one of the fundamental causes of grievance held by the Italian leaders after the Paris Peace Conference. In Mussolini's mind, the way to fix this problem from the past was for Italy to control some amount of Yugoslavia, and then to also have a lot of control in the new Croatian territories, sort of as a puppet state, I guess. But Mussolini was not in a great position to make these things happen when conversations started with the Germans about what the future of Yugoslavia looked like. The Croatian leader that the Italians supported was Pavelić, who was a member of the Croatian Ustasha, a relatively small but very dedicated nationalist group. The Germans instead supported a different Ustasha leader, Colonel Metternich, who would actually declare a new government on April 10th with German support. However, after discussions with the Italians, they were allowed to put their man in charge of the new Croatian government, but it was almost immediately a disaster. The core issue that Pavelić would face was that he had simply bartered away too much for Italian support, and most importantly, this included large areas of Dalmatia along the Adriatic coast, which the Italians had been lusting over for a very long time. This fact did not sit well with many Croatians. They considered that territory part of Croatia. And this started the Pavelić government off in a very bad position that would only deteriorate further in the years ahead. Croatia was also not the only area that would be broken away from the former Yugoslavia by the German and Italian occupation, with another important area being Slovenia. Slovenia had certain areas that were rich in mineral deposits and industrial capabilities, and this made the Germans, of course, very concerned that those areas remain under their direct control. They wanted to capitalize on those resources. The Italians were not necessarily in a position to dispute this idea, and therefore the Germans would have most of the control over these areas. But when you look at the situation on the ground, this sort of distribution of areas made very little sense. Most of the Italian-controlled areas of the former Yugoslavia were rural areas, and they had been important consumers for the more urban northern areas that the Germans now had under their control. With the border drawn between them, there were issues on both sides. In the urban areas, they had lost access to a lot of the food that they used to get, and they also lost access to the markets for their goods that they used to sell to. On the rural side, they lost access to a lot of the manufactured goods that they used to pull from the cities and markets for the farm goods that they were producing in those rural areas. And of course, neither the Italians or the Germans cared about this at all. They didn't care what the Slovene citizens were having issues with in these areas. They just knew that there was a new border between one area and another, and they were going to make sure that the only people crossing those borders were people that they knew about. This is one small example of a much greater problem that many areas of Europe would face under German occupation. They had a tendency to draw lines on maps where they wanted them, or where they were most favorable to the Germans, without a whole lot of concern about what the locals needed and what was best for the local economy and the local people. But that conversation will be in a future episode. Don't worry, I'm already working on it. One of the interesting things about the territories of Yugoslavia that the Germans and Italians had captured during their invasion and that they controlled after the surrender was signed is that while they had captured them quite easily, they would become some of the territories with the strongest resistance to German and Italian occupation. There were many different groups that would take part in this resistance, often focused around specific ethnic groups that felt that they were not being properly treated by the invaders. This included Serbs and Croats and Slovenes and many other groups. They all had their own resistance organizations, bringing their pre-existing distrust of one another into the resistance landscape. They were often based in the more mountainous terrain, where it was far more difficult for not just the occupiers, but also the successor governments to suppress them. The overall situation was wildly complicated in these areas and would require multiple podcast episodes to untangle. Maybe we'll get there someday. But for right now, the important thing to remember is that this was a resistance and occupation with far more than just two sides to the equation. An important player in these events would be the governments like the one that was created to lead the new Croatian state, with the Ustasha party carrying out what can be best described as a policy of ethnic cleansing in some areas. This was targeted at many of the groups that other atrocities would target in Eastern Europe, Gypsies, Jews, and similar groups. But within Yugoslavia, there was the added animosity between the peoples that had formerly been a part of Yugoslavia. This meant that many Serbs were killed or deported from the new Croatian state as a kind of punishment for what had happened in the past. The Ustasha government would also use religion as a blunt weapon against those it sought to suppress, with Catholicism being an important part of what was considered a member of the Croatian society. It created a recipe for violence, and that violence would happen. I also want to emphasize that I am using Ustasha as an example here, but it is just one of the many groups that found themselves in control of territories in the Balkans and Eastern Europe during the war, with many of those other groups embarking on similar programs of violence and oppression. The fires were often fed by the German occupiers as well, who had their own racist beliefs and policies that would see them both support and lead some acts of violence. This included acts of retribution due to actions of the resistance, which would continue until the very final days of occupation in 1945. While Yugoslavia was coming under occupation and being split up among different new governments and occupation zones, the former leaders of Yugoslavia would go into exile and would continue as a government in exile in London for the rest of the war. They would arrive in June 1941 to join the growing number of such governments that all called the British capital home, but they would be in an awkward position for the entire war. The British government did not have any firm agreements with the pre-war Yugoslav leaders, and there was not much that they could do about the ongoing situation in the country after 1941. With the Soviet leaders, their relations were also a bit odd, due to the position of the Soviets before the German invasion, and then the specific views that the Soviets had for a post-war Eastern Europe in the final years of the war. There was some goodwill to be exploited from the United States, who expressed their support for the Yugoslav leaders, but that support was very limited to some lend-lease goods, and that was about it. It did not help that the government in exile had only a tenuous claim to the leadership of Yugoslavia, and it did not represent some kind of firm and long-standing tradition like, say, the Norwegian king did when he went into exile. There were many unanswered questions about whether or not they even represented the desires of all of the people of Yugoslavia, due to the known and unresolved disagreements between the peoples in Yugoslavia, like the Serbs and the Croats. And so the government in exile would just kind of drift through the war years, and the post-war years would see rapid developments that would change the course of Yugoslavia until the current day. But for the people of Yugoslavia, whether they supported the idea of Yugoslavia or not, they were just another on the growing list of countries that had been invaded and forced to surrender to the German military. And the Wehrmacht and the Italian army hoped to add another to that list in the immediate aftermath, Greece, a campaign that will be the focus of the podcast here in a few episodes, after we take a few to discuss the rather bold plan from the Royal Navy to attack the Italian Navy at Taranto.